Sonja Weber, you're a classical rider and trainer. You're in Frankfurt, Germany, where we are right now. You have more than 25 years of experience in classical riding, and you've also learned from many different classical riders as well. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today, and I think, in my opinion, you show really well how good training connects to the progressive development of the horse's body and a correct and balanced posture. So thank you so much for being here with me today for this episode of Inside the Manege.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm looking forward to it.
So after your more than 25 years of experience, what motivates you the most to share your knowledge about the connection between good training and the development of the horse's body?
I find this is a very important and also very meaningful task, and I wish to share it with a lot of people. This is why I also offer a training program for becoming a trainer, because for me, dressage is not an end in and of itself. Rather, the point is that horses shouldn't suffer in carrying out the work that they do. Nowadays, this isn't necessary. And if we make an effort to train them well, they'll be able to stay truly healthy as a riding horse and also be content as well. This way, an enjoyable and safe partnership is possible, and that's why I'm committed to this. And this also applies to all breeds and all riding styles. It's about laying this foundation for the horse.
You mentioned that the horses shouldn't have to suffer anymore. What do you mean by this, and how can you use training to keep the horse healthy long term?
What I mean by this is that, of course, these days, at least in many regions, we have the luxury of being able to provide horses with a comfortable life, and we're no longer so dependent on them, so that, say, during wars or difficult situations, the horses aren't also put in difficult situations. So we have this luxury and we also have this joy, and I believe we should share this with the horses out of a sense of responsibility and out of respect for these creatures. They are simply wonderful, they fascinate so many people, and yet due to ignorance or of course the desire to show off or be successful, there are still many ways in which horses can be mistreated, whether consciously or unconsciously. And this is why I'm committed to showing and continually educating others about what this is really all about.
For those listening who might not know you or your work well yet, why should they listen to this conversation?
It's important for every riding horse to receive training, and in that sense, it's very important and interesting for every rider to gain a clearer idea of these things and to see what training involves.
An important concept or an important principle of classical riding is that one should use dressage for the horse and not the horse for dressage. What role do you find that this plays in your own work?
I'd say that it's completely fulfilled because I only started to take an interest in dressage as a young woman after I realized that I was interested in endurance riding and had really thought a lot about how it could be done in a way that wouldn't harm the horse even when performing at higher levels. And that's when I realized that dressage is essential. Of course, it varies a bit by breed and also by constitution, but it's so important and meaningful for everyone involved. And that's why I've also looked very closely into how to explain these things without giving the impression that this is just for a certain elite working at the very top. An elite that, as a normal, maybe recreational rider or even as a competitive rider, you have nothing to do with. Yes, and there are fundamental principles that must be followed, and for me, that's the most decisive thing. I also set out to figure out exactly what this is all about, and that's what I can explain in detail here.
A really important topic for you and in your work, from what I've seen, is developing the horse's body through collection. Could you talk a little bit about this? And for example, you talk about bringing the horse from a horizontal balance to a vertical balance. What does this mean, and why is it so important to incorporate collection into training?
Well, I'll start from the very beginning. We're talking about classical dressage, which can mean a lot of different things, but for me, it's classical when it's about cultivating the nature of the horse. That means that collection must not and cannot be something that fails to respect the horse's nature. And conversely, there are situations in which the horse moves in collection naturally. In the wild, the best examples are display behaviors or stallion behaviors, that is aggressive behavior, but also when fleeing. In various situations, the horse begins to lift itself up. The most crucial thing is that it lifts its rib cage, trunk and forehand up between the shoulder blades, and because the horse has no collarbone, it's critical to develop the musculature that enables this. This means that the whole thing has a kind of overall effect. When the horse naturally moves in collection, it lifts its rib cage, automatically raises its neck, arches it slightly, and comes into a rounded frame. And this effect extends throughout the entire body. This means that the pelvis tilts or tucks in slightly so that the distance between the shoulder joint and the hip joint becomes a little bit shorter. The hindquarters become a bit rounder and the horse essentially bends its stifles just a little bit. This means that the joints of the hindquarters should all bend evenly in this situation, and it's very important that the horse's stifles are actually involved. If you take this basic natural position and train the horse to maintain it over a longer period of time, under the rider's weight, that is the task. And whether you are performing specific dressage movements or not, the goal is to develop what is known as the horse's carrying capacity through developing this musculature. And the purpose of many of the movements used in dressage is to achieve this. Achieving this is not very easy because when we sit on the horse with our weight, we do the exact opposite. We press the horse's torso down between the shoulder blades with our weight, and this happens to a greater or lesser extent depending on how supple a horse is, or how weak or how strong and stable. This means we usually have to work on this for years to develop this strength, and the tension that typically arises due to the rider sitting on the horse must first be released. The horse's balance needs to be regained, and then, little by little, this strength is trained more intensively. Of course, this involves the entire body, and the strength of the hind legs also helps contribute to this upwards lifting tendency. And with that, you already arrive at verticality. By this, I really just mean a way of moving in which this raising of the forehand occurs. And in my interpretation, this is already collection. This means that when the goal is to train a riding horse, one doesn't automatically have to differentiate between collected gaits, that is shortened and almost artificial gaits, and extended or medium gaits. What is actually decisive is how the horse moves. In what basic posture and in what position, and that's by no means an easy task, especially for amateurs.
And why is it so important? For example, why do you think this is so important for the horse's health? What happens, for example, if you don't work on this?
If you don't put effort into working on this, and again, this depends on what kind of horse it is and how unstable or soft it is in its own basic constitution, then the ligaments, tendons, and fascia are either quite soft and elastic or rather quite tight. In that respect, there are already rather large differences, but more or less the essential point for every horse in the long run is that if the spine, or rather the entire trunk, sinks between the forelegs, which, unlike in us humans, are not connected to the spine by a bone like our collarbone, then as time goes on, and if the spine gradually sinks between the forelegs, there will be many problems throughout the whole body. The horse loses its balance and pushes its weight forwards over its forelegs. This means that the front legs then work leaning backward, which puts constant pressure on the elbows, for example. Then this leads to muscle spasms in the back. These spasms prevent the hind legs from working as they normally would in contributing to the horse's carrying capacity and, of course, helping with this forward shifting situation. So all the functions of the hind legs are restricted. Most of the time, problems in the sacroiliac joint also arise relatively quickly. You find many blockages there, and in the case that all of this persists long-term, lameness typically develops as part of this unfavorable overall condition in the body, with these blocked areas also contributing to various physical problems elsewhere in the horse. This means that well-considered training keeps the horse healthy overall. It's not just about the locomotor system, but rather about the horse's overall health, which includes both physical and metabolic health.
There's actually a lot of criticism about, for example, the working lives of sport horses. And many people say, for example, that they have a very short, healthy life in equestrian sport. But how do you see this? And do you think that what you've just explained plays a role?
Well, I'm concerned that these days it's drifting far apart. That wasn't often the case in the past. In the past, larger riding institutions certainly had leaders or members who also competed in competitions. And originally, riding was rooted in these institutions. That's why I say they were so successful in the sense that the horses aged healthily and remained rideable well past the age of 25. And when things went really well, they even kept their full potential. And nowadays, when you say that many sport horses don't stay healthy, in my view, that is because firstly, it is a very long process to train a horse well. It requires a lot of expertise, and of course, that also involves money, that's clear. And the results along the way are not necessarily spectacular from the very beginning. Perhaps quite beautiful, but not necessarily spectacular. And the more attention is paid to spectacular movement patterns, by which I mainly mean the forehand, the more quickly the horse ends up developing a hollow back. This happens because when the forehand is activated too much, especially before the musculature for lifting the forehand and trunk has developed, the horse, through this exaggerated movement, falls into a hollow back. At that point, the horse is no longer able to use the hindquarters as it should, while at the same time it's still expected to produce even more exaggerated movement with the hind legs. The horse ends up in a dilemma, having to perform things that it can't do in this way because it lacks the training for it. And in that sense, I also view this like previous speakers and many colleagues do critically and with great concern, that equestrian sport has moved so far away from the original purpose of dressage, at least as I understand it. With respect to the question of what my task is and what I consider a meaningful task, it's exactly to counteract this. Because even in equestrian institutions, it's not like it used to be, where it was 100% ensured that these principles, these natural principles, would continue to be followed. There are many reasons for this, which one can speculate about. Certainly, some of it is also due to the spirit of the times. Nowadays, everything is supposed to go faster, higher, further. It's meant to be spectacular, it's meant to make an impression, it's not meant to be laborious, and it should be something you can buy. A lot of this doesn't fit with riding, nor with what is required for it. And in that sense, I believe it's important to guide those people who are concerned with the horse's well-being. That's also been my own experience and background. I've always tended to be involved with people who truly mean well for their horses, but simply meaning well is unfortunately not enough, because learning to ride well is demanding, and therefore a lot of expertise is required. If you only mean well but don't know how to do things properly, you can just as easily, and I really mean just as easily, ruin a horse just as if it were trained in sport in an excessive, incorrect and forceful way. In that sense, I see it as my task to inspire people and to guide them, and also to help spread this further together with my trainers. The demand is high, there is growing interest, and I think this is also because the public is becoming increasingly critical of competitive riding, which may also be one reason why your excellent episodes have met so much resonance. As interest in alternatives, some of which may have existed before, is growing, but even in the past, this wasn't something for the mass market. It wasn't something that just anyone around the corner could do or afford. And that's why equestrian sport hadn't for many years become a widely practiced sport. That's also one reason, I think, why many things aren't going so well, because people don't have access to the necessary knowledge and resources. Yeah.
Yes, many also say that a lot of knowledge has been lost and that equestrian sport has changed a bit. But there are, of course, very, very good sport riders. That's not what I mean. And they also have a lot of expertise and specialist knowledge. But what do you see specifically, for example, in competition, especially in relation to collection, when you see a piaffe or a passage, for example? There are many Costco riders who are a bit critical of such things. And from your understanding of collection, how do you see this?
So the piaffe is actually a good example, because for me, the piaffe has several purposes. One purpose is that you can use the piaffe to make a diagnosis, where if the piaffe is not correct, and part of that correctness includes certain factors. An important factor is that the pairs of legs work vertically. This means that the hooves are positioned directly under the point from which the legs are suspended above them. Neither placed closer together nor further apart, so that neither leg pair is angled back nor pushed forward. In sport riding, when too much emphasis is placed on big exaggerated movements too early, and the horse's balance and carrying capacity are not yet developed, then when people try to achieve this collected movement, the horse tends to push itself together and become compressed. This is then called a V-shaped piaffe. And at that point, one can see that the basic requirements that would actually be necessary, the foundations for performing a correct piaffe, have not been developed because other aspects were prioritized. And the horse then has to try to perform something on the spot and compensate for what it hasn't been taught. Also, the carrying capacity isn't developed. Unfortunately, this can often also be seen in the musculature, where the neck and withers stick out and are poorly covered by muscle, as is the back. And in that way, the horse goes into a compensation pattern and usually has to overly round its back behind the saddle in order to compensate in this V shape. This means that the lumbosacral junction is open. It must remain closed, which means the back is properly round. This is why in my work I've dealt a lot with what collection actually is. The rounding of the back shouldn't occur behind the saddle. Some people think that the main thing is that everything comes up. No, unfortunately, that's not how it is. There mustn't be a hollow back, but above all, the front end has to be lifted. And if the horse can't do that and can't lift its front end from the forelimbs and is put into a piaffe, it has to compensate because it's also not trained in the hock joints to compress evenly, like an accordion or a spring. And then the hind legs come too far underneath. The pelvis is sometimes tilted too much, sometimes too little. And sometimes this pushing forward over the forehand comes from the hip joint, which is something horses constantly train in the more extended gaits. And when this lumbosacral junction, so the loin area behind the saddle and further back, is open, then the transmission of power from the hind legs no longer goes through the entire body of the horse. This is like a break, somewhat similar to the incorrect braking or excessive bending of the neck that can occur between the second and the third vertebrae. So if a horse cannot lift its trunk, it will usually also have problems at the pole, and then if the reins are still used in such a way that the horse has to give, the so-called break at the third often occurs. This means that the horse doesn't yield at the pole, but at the third cervical vertebra. And here too, the transmission of force is interrupted, and the same happens behind the saddle. This is a typical phenomenon. It's still often more complex and varied, but it's a very characteristic issue seen in sport, and it proves that something in this process has not taken place, in the sense of developing the horse's body with regard to natural collection and maintaining soundness.
And I wanted to come back to the point you mentioned earlier, namely the anatomical aspect of how this works in the horse. You spoke a little about the thoracic sling. Could you explain a bit more about it for those who aren't yet very familiar with it? What does it look like in the horse and how does it actually function? Just so they can get a better understanding from a biomechanical perspective.
Yes, I've already tried to explain that the forelegs are the parts from which the trunk has to be lifted upwards with the so-called thoracic sling. And in particular with the pectoralis and the serratus muscles. And one can see that when looking at the horse over time, it develops what are like natural pads behind the shoulder blades. The chest becomes somewhat broader because the musculature between the shoulder blades increases, which enables the horse to push itself upwards. Which also hasn't really been discussed for a long time. What in the forehand actually has to be trained? What needs to happen with the forehand? It's not only the hindquarters that lead to and help the horse learn to carry itself in an elevated posture. The forehand is important and involved as well. And at the moment this occurs, the junction between the neck and back vertebrae, this downwards curve, is lifted slightly. Through this lifting, the spinous processes tilt slightly backwards, pointing more into the back, so to say, and they don't stick out in such a fanned-out way. And around, and especially in front of them, the neck musculature is very strong, so that one sees a horse that looks large in front, but also long in front. So the ideal state is that the horse becomes shorter behind than in a normal standing position and becomes longer in the front. but longer in an upwards direction. That means, for example, if one were mainly to bring the horse into a lifted posture by raising the horse's head with the rider's hands, it can happen that this downward curve is compressed and in this way remains low, and the horse then comes up in front but ultimately stays hollow in the back. And the crucial point is that when the area of this downward curve of the neck is lifted, it can open and then the horse becomes long and can, one might say, become through the pole completely on its own. So perhaps that's firstly what relates to the forehand.
Yeah, without a collarbone, the ribcage essentially hangs between the forelegs and is held only by muscles, fascia, and other tissues. But I think many people aren't even aware of this yet, and that through working the muscles, you can actually completely change a horse's posture. And I also find this very interesting. I find it super interesting that in your work you regularly see, and you also post pictures of the physical changes you see through training horses you have in training or your own horses. Could you talk a little bit about the changes you often see through training?
Yes, there are many horses that aren't so well built, which either through breeding or perhaps also through incorrect or insufficient training are in a physical state that's closer to a sunken posture. This can also be recognized, for example, by an overdeveloped underneck. An inverted neck or overdeveloped underneck is nothing other than a sunken base of the neck, which needs to be gradually brought back up through training. As you're asking how the body changes, the musculature along the top of the neck becomes broader in this direction and also essentially higher. The horse appears larger, the withers don't stick out as much and are embedded in muscle. Ideally, the muscles along the left and right side of the spine are also relaxed, able to do their job and well developed so that the spinal column doesn't stand out at any point along the back. And the croup should, of course, be round and well muscled overall, and the muscles of the hindquarters that extend further down to where the hind legs narrow should also develop through training both to the sides and back. This always varies depending on the type of horse, but that when you look at the horse and it is simply standing there, you already get the impression that it stands somewhat more upright and that its body proportions appear more harmonious and also more beautiful. So, what we perceive as a beautiful horse will be achieved more. In veterinary medicine, there's also been a term for an abnormal compensatory posture, or ACP. It's abnormal compensatory posture in English or something like that. This means a horse that's in a state of postural fatigue or Topline syndrome where the opposite has taken place. That is a long-term condition in which the trunk has sunken down. This means that the trunk is then supported mainly only by fascia and ligaments, while the musculature is underdeveloped and this fascial system stiffens. The body produces mass wherever there's a need for it. This means that the connective tissue network, which also surrounds the entire body, becomes stiff in the areas where the trunk is meant to be supported and is no longer elastic. This means that lifting the trunk becomes very difficult for such horses, and because this stiffening occurs, this system is more prone to wear. That's why one should not, as I have often experienced, ride horses only in a low position. Because although this may lead to a certain relaxation of the back, the front part of the trunk usually isn't carried in a high position. That is, it's not truly lifted. It is purely theoretically possible. For example, if a stallion is presenting himself and lifting himself up, and then while moving and presenting and elevating himself, he lowers his head to sniff a pile of manure or whatever else might smell interesting, then he can remain lifted in the trunk and still lower his neck. However, this is a highly specific situation in nature, and I would argue that very, very few riders manage to reproduce this specific situation. For the horse, it's more normal to carry the head and neck somewhat higher so that this functional connection also works. I've now been speaking about this compensatory posture. This means that one can see from the horse's conformation that it might have been an attractive, well-formed horse by breeding, but through its usage and through insufficient or incorrect training, it's already lost some of its natural brilliance, and depending on the horse's overall stability, the angles of the joints can also change to a certain extent. Many people today still believe that that's just the way the horse's conformation is, but that's not true. If it's possible to damage a horse, for example by riding it with a hollow back or by pushing the trunk downward over the long term into this state of compromised carrying capacity, then this is usually accompanied by a dropped pelvis. That is, the pelvis sinks too far down in front and the croup becomes flatter. And here, if this posture becomes chronic, it increasingly develops to the point where you can clearly see this condition in the horse, and suddenly people think the horse has poor conformation, even though it may have won at a breeding show as a young horse. And conversely, and this is what I work towards and why I like to show such examples, you can take a horse that may not be particularly well built with certain things that go against the optimal physical characteristics for a riding horse, and through training, this doesn't happen quickly or easily. You can influence the conformation to some extent so that it appears as though the horse were well bred. It works both ways, and I believe it's so important to understand this because most people believe otherwise, which is why I'm always somewhat critical about where and when one buys young horses. Because depending on the way they are kept, a young horse can develop quite differently, even though it has certain genetic predispositions.
Yeah, I find this so interesting. I can also confirm from my own experience that when I was growing up, most horses looked a little bit like that, with, let's say, not the most optimal musculature. And for me, that was completely normal. But many people, and I did too back then, assume that the way that the horse looks while in the paddock, if it's only ridden a few times a week or is mostly only ridden straight, maybe doing a few circles, a diagonal, and with no collected work, that this is just how it looks and that its conformation won't change. And then they see a super beautiful horse and believe that this simply comes from the genes and that it must be very expensive because it's well bred. But what's so inspiring to me about this work and about classical dressage and all of the knowledge behind it is seeing that this is actually not true and that a beautiful horse also develops through training. And even a normal horse can achieve a lot more than one thinks. For example, I often get comments on my episodes saying, yeah, but you can't really do a piaffe with a quarter horse, or that's just not possible, or try that with a normal horse, it won't work. But I've seen many times that this is entirely possible. You just need to have the knowledge and the experience. It can be, however, quite difficult to find the right trainers who can actually teach and demonstrate this, no? That's really the question. But you've mentioned so many points now. I'd like to go back to Topline syndrome and abnormal compensatory posture.
If I may briefly add something to that, firstly, I also have pictures where I show that every type of horse can develop a correct piaffe. Of course, there are certain limits which belong to its natural build, and they will not all look exactly the same, but they'll display correctness of the key aspects. So, in that sense, it's actually independent of the breed, it's a matter of training. How do you get there? Some horses can do it more easily, and for others, it's not so easy, but it's not dependent on the breed or type of horse. That's one side of it. The other side of it, to come back to what is natural, when you look at a stallion, for example, his hormones help his musculature to become stronger. That is one point. Secondly, a stallion presents himself. This means he uses exactly the muscles that we actually want to train in riding. That's why a stallion often already looks much more like a riding horse, and we also perceive this as more beautiful, but this is due to the hormones and his natural behavior. Now, I'm assuming here that the stallion is not being trained simply in comparison to a gelding or a mare moving in the field, whether it's for breeding or otherwise, it will look different. But this shows that if you take that stallion and don't train him in any particular way, and then you castrate him, you'll see a big change in his body. And if a riding horse is gelded, it's important to train him fairly soon so that he doesn't lose these important muscles, which he may already have developed. One can see that this is actually a very natural thing, and we as humans tend to respond to what's beautiful quite instinctively. This has been widely studied in theories of harmony and in similar fields. We're drawn to symmetry, we're drawn to what looks healthy, and there's a causal connection there. In most cases, we also find beautiful what is functional and healthy. That is, where a body is in harmony or in a balanced state. But this is something I wanted to add to this topic.
Yeah, exactly. So I also wanted to come back to the topic of Topline syndrome or abnormal compensatory posture, just in case it's something that's new for some listeners and to go into it a little bit more deeply. How do you find this develops on horses, for example? You've described really well what it looks like with things like indents in the musculature, a sunken back, and so on. But how does this actually happen?
It happens by itself when you ride the horse without training it in a way that helps it learn to carry itself and use its body in a way that's both sustainable and healthy for a riding horse. This means that for Topline syndrome or an abnormal compensatory posture, you don't necessarily have to do much for it to develop. However, there are certainly training approaches which are more likely to lead in that direction than others. There are also examples in high-level sport where horses perform advanced movements which would normally indicate the opposite, meaning good posture and carrying capacity, and yet they still show signs of ACP. This can be seen in incorrect movements, uneven movements, mechanical or robotic movements, when the hind end is too high, if they have a V-shaped outline, everything I've already mentioned before, a neck that's too low or overflexed and everything else, then it can be that even though the horse has been trained for a long time, a lack of correct development or incorrect training, for example, with a hollow back from too much exaggerated movement, can still lead to this condition. So there are various different ways, such as insufficient training or incorrect training. Yeah, that's how you could summarize it.
In your view, what are the most important elements of collection? You've already mentioned the forehand and how its role is somewhat underestimated, but what are some of the other elements of collection?
So, if I list all the factors involved which play a role, the first thing that naturally stands out is, of course, the horse's elevated posture. An elevated neck that ideally isn't shortened, that is well-rounded, and with a pole that's of course the highest point. But really a horse that comes into a certain degree of roundness and self-carriage. The pole is free when the trunk is lifted. Then a back that should neither sag nor be overly rigid or braced upwards, and a rounded croup from which the entire hind legs, including the major joints like the hips, stifles, hocks, and down to the fetlocks, should be able to flex. This means that the horse must also be elastic for this to be possible, and related to this, then, which is also very interesting, is a shock-absorbing function. There are these shock absorbers in both the forehand and the hindquarters. In the hindquarters, this is relatively easy to imagine. If you think of it like an accordion, when you compress it, you get a cushioning effect. But the forehand has this as well. When the horse maintains a more lifted posture, the shoulder blades also come into a slightly diagonal position. And from there, the upper forelegs follow, meaning the shoulder joint becomes somewhat more flexed. And if the forelegs don't work in a tilted back position, but rather in a more vertical way, again, this is always about an average, then the elbow joint is correspondingly flexed as well. If this entire area is free of blockages, the horse can also effectively absorb impact all the way down into the fetlocks, so that in the forehand, the shock-absorbing function takes place through both the shoulder and the elbow joint. When the trunk sinks down due to an abnormal compensatory posture and the forelegs begin to tilt backwards, this angle opens and the shock-absorbing effect is decreased. This resulting overload increases the already existing overloading of the forehand because impact can no longer be absorbed as effectively. And regarding these impacts, when I say free of blockages, I mean that the horse must be able to move in a loose, supple way. Loose in this context means that the muscles that are actively needed are working and their antagonists must also be able to release. This is not always easy with a riding horse, depending on the situation. But it's the fundamental requirement for avoiding restrictions and blockages, and if restrictions can be avoided, it becomes possible to develop a spring-like elasticity. This spring force takes place within the horse's tissues. It means that the fascial system, which also includes tendons and ligaments, when it is free and unrestricted and surrounds the entire body in a relatively uninhibited way, it can store kinetic energy during movement. For example, when the hoof makes contact with the ground, the fetlock lowers and the ligaments and tendons are stretched. If this loading phase is relatively long, kinetic energy is stored within these tissues. When the horse then pushes off again, the release happens almost automatically. It's somewhat similar to a small frog, which can jump extremely high. It follows a similar process within its body and then lets go. So it stores kinetic energy, which relates to its bodily structure, and then releases it. As a result, it jumps up very high and needs very little effort for this. And with the horse, it's similar. When this functions without any blockages and when we cultivate it together with the horse's shock absorbers, the horse is able to increasingly develop the elasticity of its movements, which then appear more powerful, while at the same time requiring less effort. This is also very interesting for horses that need to cover long distances, in that developing this spring-like elasticity is an important part of training, and it depends on having as few restrictions as possible. That means that the entire horse needs this gymnastic development and must also be flexible. Flexibility means that not only is the body flexible, but also that the horse is mobile. And with mobile, I mean it has the ability to move freely in space. So mobility is part of it. You should be able to move the horse easily in space here and there, and that brings us to the topic of balance. Balance isn't something that can be developed in one day. Rather, fully developed balance under the rider is a long process that never really ends, because the horse can quickly fall back into imbalance again. And for balance, it's essential that you can influence the horse's direction and tempo at any moment in any situation. If you're ever not sure whether your horse is moving out of balance, try to halt. And if you can't do it immediately, then either there's a lack of clear communication, or more likely, the horse isn't balanced enough to be able to halt right away, assuming it understood. There are these typical cases. Some horses always try to run, they lack balance, while others are more lazy and slow and don't like to move. Training leads to the lazy horses becoming more willing to move again through gymnastic development, the release of blockages, and by bringing the body together, an energy is created that the horse can easily access, and suddenly it will have much more motivation to move. Of course, each horse has its own character, is a certain breed and type. There are differences, but overall, even lazy horses can be made more willing through correct training. In other words, when you develop the body, things become easier, and those horses that are constantly running ahead of their balance become calmer and easier to control. So if I have a horse that can change direction at any moment and can go very fast or very slowly immediately and without any delay, then I have it fully in balance. And so in that sense, it's not so complicated. I can also check if I'm riding a lateral movement from left to right and I can no longer stop or turn and go forward, then I know the horse is drifting to the right, for example, falling onto the right shoulder. It may be moving sideways, but it's not serving the purpose of improving the balance, for example, strengthening the inside hind leg. Rather, the horse is simply falling to the side and forward with its weight. And this brings us to an important point where you can say that in riding, what matters most in everything is how it's done.
Yeah, totally.
So it's not necessarily about what is done, and this again relates to the connection with sport. If a passage doesn't fulfill its fundamental principles, Anja Beran, for example, has many very good, really striking videos for training the eye that show how certain things need to work in the body. And if that's not the case, then actually it shouldn't even be called a passage. Whatever you do, whether it's simply halting or transitioning from halt to moving forwards, the most basic exercises or the most advanced, it's always about the quality of what the horse is doing. And for me, movements are only of interest if they're the result of the correct development of the body and at the same time create that correct development. These things are interconnected.
Yeah.
If you manage to develop a horse in the right way, then a piaffe or a passage will directly support this physical development. If you don't, it might even worsen the horse's condition, so it always has to be considered in relation to its function as a riding horse. It may still be somewhat different for a carriage horse or a liberty dressage horse, but for every horse that's ridden, these principles apply.
And what about the back? There's also a lot said about the horse's back, especially in relation to collection, such as that it has to be lifted. For example, many people say that riding in a long and a low position is an important first step to prepare the horse for collection, with the idea that it allows the horse to lift its back. But what are your thoughts on using this method in preparing for collection?
Yes, so the idea behind this, as I mostly hear it explained, is to relax the horse so that the back doesn't tense up and so that the horse doesn't raise its neck and fall into having a hollow back. This idea is, of course, sensible, at least in most cases, if it's used over a longer period without incorporating training that also promotes an elevated posture. And if one stays too long in this horizontal frame using predominantly the horse's forward driving forces, then true carrying capacity develops only a little or not at all. Of course, there are very good horses with very good riders who are also able to ride in a stretching frame in such a way that the horse doesn't collapse in the trunk. But the issue is more or less that I'm more interested in approaches that can be applied to a wide variety of horses and also to riders who aren't yet so highly trained. That's why for me, and I introduced this term many years ago, a stretching frame is essentially a resting posture. This means I can alternate the training in any gait, which makes sense in any case, where after a phase in which I actively promote the lifting of the trunk and work on exercises that develop this, I can add breaks either by allowing the horse to walk on a long rein or by riding forward in a rising trot where it stretches the neck. From my experience, the trunk will usually drop slightly again, which is also okay because the muscles are allowed to rest in these moments. This can also be done in the canter. In this sense, I do find the stretching frame useful, but for that which it can do, meaning as a posture for relaxation and having a break. What's important, however, is to understand that in training for carrying capacity, the horse also mustn't become tense. The horse exerts effort and is allowed to rest in between, but it mustn't become tense. One shouldn't think that work equals tension, followed by relaxation. There are also many horses, and this absolutely has to be taken into account, for whom the stretching frame causes such a significant loss of balance that they fall back into states of tension, and in such cases the entire purpose is lost. These horses find relaxation instead in slowing down and through beginning to develop their balance. This means that the so-called relaxation exercise has then completely lost its purpose, and the strengthening exercise is actually what's produced relaxation. Yeah, that's how one could think about it.
And you also talk about the rotation of the spine, which I found very interesting to read. Could you also talk a little bit about this, how it works, and the correct rotation of the horse's spine?
Yes, I'd like to add one more small point about the stretching frame because it tends to provoke strong reactions and often leads to a kind of division in opinion. And I can only speak from my own experience. I practiced the stretching frame for 10 years within my almost 30 years of my full-time professional career. I need to emphasize that I didn't just do this on the side. I used the stretching frame for 10 years. There were some positive aspects, but overall I later changed my approach. My own path or training journey has always continued to evolve through different teachers, experiences, and different horses. And anyway, this shouldn't stay static. So I've always continued to educate myself, and regardless of what level, I think that one absolutely needs external perspectives and new ideas. The nature of the horse has so many facets that one can't manage to force all of these different cases into a single system or method. And I also don't want to do that. This is why I talk about a general concept within which I orient myself around the horse. I have also named this and I call it equicentered. The approach is equicentered, where Equus, the horse, is at the center of decision making, and this also means that the methods used are within a certain framework. I don't use every method, but rather those that are reasonably compatible, used and adapted for each individual horse. And for me, this is a concept rather than just a method. It's not a matter of only using the right horses in order for a method to work, or of applying the same method regardless and accepting that with some horses the results simply don't turn out as well. And through this development, I've moved away from the idea of using the stretching frame as a goal that I aim to develop. And what was interesting for me was that when I went directly to exercises where I didn't bring the balance into question as much, I found that the horse would spontaneously stretch on its own during the breaks afterwards. This meant that I no longer needed to focus on the stretching at all. That was also an interesting experience because with some horses it had previously been quite difficult to even encourage them to stretch in the first place. If you get them to a point where through balance and gymnastic work they perform certain exercises that both strengthens and loosens their muscles, then they start doing it on their own. So why would I need to focus on working on it anymore? Just to clarify my position, I'm not the kind of person who condemns something. I have 10 years of experience with this and I've moved away from it. For me, it's now a resting posture or something that can be used on the lunge when the horse moves how it wants during a time where it has this freedom. It may also stretch itself, of course. Again, this is something that's also important to me. And now coming back to the topic you asked about, namely the rotation, what is actually meant by this and why is it? And I actually find this quite positive because on the one hand, fortunately, there is currently a return to the old masters, to the cultural knowledge and the wide range of ways that this knowledge can be applied, which in many cases has been lost. This is also very sensible. But I also think it's important to look at what current progress, along with experiences from other fields, maybe even from outside of riding, can be of use. And there have already been a few people, such as Jean-Claude Racinet, who was engaged quite a lot with osteopathy. And in osteopathy, at least according to the osteopath Dominique Gignot, the rotation of the spine does play a role. And even Racinet himself and later also others have studied this topic, and it's that one has to imagine that when a horse moves, the ribcage rotates slightly from side to side. And there are also discussions about this question: can a horse actually bend through its trunk at all? In some areas of the spine, this ability to bend is not possible, and in other areas it's only possible to a very limited degree. What does happen, however, is that the ribcage can rotate. So this means if I imagine, for example, a lateral bend to the left, as seen from my perspective, I move the ribcage slightly downward on the left side with the inside leg so that the spinous processes at the top of the spine tilt slightly inward. This is about an average rotation because in the movement there is also a slight continuous rotation of the ribcage. But in this left bend, the vertebral bodies rotate to the left, and in this situation, the horse is best able to lift the front of its trunk when the rotation, although there are no spinous processes there, the vertebral bodies of the neck also rotate in the same direction again on average. This is what one calls a transverse rotation. So, if lateral flexion is created, there's a rotational component along the horse's entire longitudinal axis, which can also create the impression that the horse is bending through its trunk. On average, this rotation allows the horse to lift itself more easily, meaning that the horse is able to come into a flexion of the back rather than an extension. An extension meaning having a hollow back. The only exception is the first vertebra directly behind the pole, which deviates from this, When the horse is flexed to the left, this vertebra has to shift outward due to anatomical constraints. So, therefore, it's not included in this transverse rotational pattern. These are just something that people have begun to observe more closely, and from the rider's perspective, the feeling is that you can stay well centered in the saddle and maybe even set slightly inward and downward, but certainly not tipped to the outside. Especially when horses are not yet well balanced in the canter and you ride a relatively tight turn, everyone knows how the saddle slides to the outside and you drift to the outside, which brings us to what's known as inverted rotation. In an untrained horse, the neck tends to bend incorrectly, meaning that it tends to bend in front of the withers at the base of the neck, for example, in our case, to the left. And if this becomes excessive, the trunk tips to the right. In other words, there is a rotation of the trunk to the outside, while the neck rotates more to the inside, and in this destabilized position, the horse can no longer properly lift its trunk, but instead stays to some extent in a hollow-backed position. The crux of all of this is that horses can still learn movements, whether with a transverse rotation or even with a hollow back. And this means that just because a horse can do a piaffe or certain movements in a collected canter, this is unfortunately no guarantee that this essential function of the transverse rotation, namely the lifting of the trunk, is actually taking place. It's a complex and demanding process to achieve this properly. This transverse rotation is also connected to the fact that the rotation within the trunk remains slightly more pronounced, as mentioned, with a hollow back and the residual tension, and so you don't sit as comfortably. If the horse then begins to lengthen the movement, you may find it quite difficult to stay in the saddle. Meanwhile, with a correct transverse rotation, you can easily sit in the center and even have the feeling of being sucked in. When the horse then extends and is able to maintain this position in a lifted way, you're almost pulled into the saddle, and at the same time, the side-to-side motion gradually diminishes and the horse becomes more stable. Because of this, I'd say that in my view, it's somewhat misleading to talk about a swinging back, because the back also requires a certain degree of stability. It's exactly because of this stability that the legs can move effectively and we can sit in the saddle quietly without damaging the horse, and the horse can keep its own balance.
Now you've gained a lot of knowledge over all these years. Could you talk a little bit about how you came to this knowledge and what your own path has looked like?
Yes, at first I worked with some important French trainers whom I trained with, and I also had influences from Portugal. Throughout this entire journey, I was accompanied by a German trainer of mine who has an exceptionally good eye and was educated in the German tradition in the old Schultheiss Lörke school, and she was also very successful in the time when this style of riding was still appreciated by judges and audiences. She accompanied me throughout, and we were always exchanging ideas and making many discoveries together. There were also influences from Vienna, from France, as I mentioned, and even from people who had emigrated to the United States. One of us would always come across something new, and if we found it interesting, we would explore it together. We were in the fortunate position of it always being the two of us discovering things and then having the great opportunity to try them out together under observation. And yeah, this is how the journey kept evolving.
Were there any particular moments along the way that showed you just how important collection or other details really are in training?
Yes, so collection, absolutely, because once one has sat on a well-trained horse and truly felt this stability, this strength, and this balance, you need a bit of luck, or you have to actively seek out opportunities to ride such horses. Only then can you really understand what's being talked about,
Yeah, definitely.
because that gives you a completely different impression than with a typical horse in a recreational riding stable. That's to say, it's an important point in this experience in order to know where things are actually heading.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the most important thing for me was maintaining the horse's health. I mean, of course, when it comes to basic constitution and overall health, there are always individual differences. But when I oriented myself around a trainer who still had old horses in the stable that were still completely sound, that was the best hallmark for me. That was the real sign. So I was only interested in people who could demonstrate that. For example, I was at Circus Kinney when the Freddie Kinney Sr. was still alive. They invited me to the training once, and there I also saw how they work with the old circus horses and school horses and saw how they looked back then, and that really interested me. So, in that sense, I couldn't only say only one thing, and one also has a certain sense oneself, maybe an intuition, but this could also always be backed up as well. And it brought me to the point where I got my horses healthy, even when there had been problems before. I had an Arabian horse which I tried to train for endurance riding, and it always had issues. That horse actually set me on the right path. It started to go lame even relatively early, and it showed me that proper training was necessary. And once I began to follow that path, I really, knock on wood, I hardly ever need a veterinarian. I almost never have anything to do with veterinarians. Of course, they come to give vaccinations, or I might bring in a manure sample or pick up a dewormer, but the horses are completely healthy overall, and in that respect, I can rely on this very well. And when horses start developing illnesses, you can almost always also find issues in the way they're ridden and in their movement patterns. Yeah, so in that sense, it's not so difficult to figure out what it actually is, and what you then need to do might be difficult to figure out, but recognizing the bigger picture, I believe, is often also possible for amateurs as well. Does it look harmonious, healthy, vital, and so on? Yeah?
Yeah, yeah, I also find this very impressive. I know a horse, he's about 25 years old, and he can do everything. Piaffe, passage, everything. Even when he's loose, he loves to gallop, to jump around, do a levade, everything. And it's so nice to see, really. For me, even when I was a kid, this wasn't really normal. The horses definitely didn't look like that, even when they were 16, 17. They were already very old horses that nobody wanted anymore, right? Which is really sad.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be like this. And I was at your stable yesterday, and it was a great experience to be there. And I had the chance to see that you also have many different breeds of horses in the stable, and that you have a lot of experience with very different horses. Could you maybe talk a bit about what horses you work with? And also, how do you apply your methods to different horses and different conformations?
Yeah, so my own personal passion, even as a child, has been for Lusitanos, and at that time they were hardly even seen in Germany. And then I had the chance through a friend to then become enthusiastic about Arabians. So I've always been captivated by hot-blooded horses, but in my work I actually find this versatility, working with these very different breeds, most compelling. I've gotten to know countless breeds over these decades, and it was exactly this which made me think about how to handle and work with each horse. And that makes it extremely interesting and always exciting in exchanging ideas. I also think it's so important to exchange ideas and to have colleagues and, of course, teachers who support you. especially when you don't have much experience with certain types of horses. To give one example, more or less from the beginning, I had Icelandic horses, and they naturally have a different purpose when they're ridden in their typical gaits. So with them, it's not about piaffe and passage or flying changes, at least usually not. And how does one train them? And then I realized that what I had learned, namely that the foundational training, the basic gymnastic work, actually takes place in walk. That is the gate for learning. This helps a lot with the balance. You have time, the rider has time, the horse has time. And for example, with an Icelandic horse, if you do good gymnastic work in walk, and this was also repeatedly confirmed through feedback to me, that then the tilt would become completely different, and maybe they even improved their scores in competition because of the quality of the rhythm, the posture, the regularity, and everything else, and so on. Or if you look at what you need for very stiff and tight horses, then it's mainly about really making them mobile and flexible. And with other horses that are already mobile and flexible, but actually quite unstable, you have to focus more on what stabilizes those horses. And of course, you need all of these elements for all horses, but in very different proportions and sometimes also at different times. What's absolutely beneficial for one horse, such as becoming more flexible, could for a horse that's already overly flexible, and this is also currently an issue, could actually be a disaster. So let's say then that those which are inflexible might have problems in lateral work doing this crossing and reaching movement, which is very small at the beginning. And I focus on developing it so that it becomes larger, and the hypermobile horse may already make its steps very big from the start, but falls all over the place, can't really hold itself, and through this movement actually falls out of its proper balance and loses even more stability. For that horse, I would design the lateral work in a way that keeps the length of the strides rather short. I don't want it to reach out even more or overstep further. Instead, I focus on teaching it to carry itself more within the exercise. And that's an important part, that you always structure the exercise so that carrying strength is addressed. And that brings us, when it comes to rotation, to an important point. Along the spine, there are muscles that span just 2 to 4 vertebrae, the multifidi. These are small muscles that are necessary for coordination and carrying strength, and they're also responsible for rotation, and they need to be activated. It isn't so easy to influence them directly, but rather through specific exercises, you can indirectly activate them. And that means for the unstable horse to create stabilization, and for the other to create more flexibility.
I also saw in the stable that you've had a few difficult horses, and I actually find stories like this very inspiring. And we spoke briefly about it yesterday, but I wanted to bring it out a little bit more, which is the connection between mental difficulties, for example, with a horse that might be traumatized or very nervous, and physical difficulties. So the link between the two, and then how you deal with it, especially in training. So how exactly do you do this, and what are your thoughts?
Well, let's say I can try to give you a few examples. Of course, firstly, I deal with a horse, a living being that also has a particular character. You always have to start from that. They're not machines, which, if you simply operate them correctly, will all end up doing the same thing. That much is clear. But there are many phenomena that do diminish over time. For example, I currently have a horse, my Lusitano Magusto, who is severely traumatized. I say is, even though the situation has improved significantly. But a genuine trauma can't simply be removed. you can only find new ways to go forward and gradually show the horse different ways so that the trauma recedes into the background but stays connected to a real trauma. He fell down several times when he was being started as a riding horse, and with a horse like this, one doesn't have to have done anything especially stupid or rough, but several unfortunate factors came together for him, and then, of course, as a prey animal and a very hypersensitive one, he became terribly agitated. Because when a hypersensitive prey animal falls down, this is the worst thing that can happen to them. It wants to flee, but it falls over. And naturally, a load on its back is interpreted as a predator, at least in instinctive terms. And it's all the more amazing how willingly horses, over many, many generations of domestication, have allowed themselves to be ridden at all. But one mustn't completely forget their original nature and that they've remained flight animals. In my diploma thesis as a biologist, I did a behavioral study in which I also compared predator avoidance, so vigilance behavior and escape behavior in response to a potential predator. Specifically, I compared wild-born horses, Przewalski's horses, with different types of domestic horses. And what came out of this was that domestic horse types, which have already been domesticated for over 5,000 years, haven't lost their original behaviors. It's somewhat different, and depending on the type of horse, they show more or less fear of certain predators. For example, horses from southern regions are also more afraid of moving objects from above because in some cases, large cats may have attacked from cliffs or trees, which is something that's not as common in northern regions, but this made this easy to recognize. The focus of this thesis was actually the reintroduction of Przewalski's horses into the wild and whether just a few generations in captivity had already disrupted their original behavior too much. And from this, we also concluded that if long domesticated horses still retain this predator avoidance behavior, then it's probably not so critical in Przewalski's horses because the period they've spent in captivity has been much shorter. And in horses, depending on the type, some flee immediately and very rapidly. So the more hot-blooded southern types tend to flee quickly and immediately. Because of this, they sometimes put themselves in danger even while fleeing, essentially rushing to their own destruction, jumping into a fence or into a car, which appears idiotic to us. But it's not idiotic because a horse that has lived in or is adapted to the steppes is safest when it runs away immediately. And in northern regions, there are also horses that tended to hide, that are more likely to freeze, and there are also differences in how they respond to an attack. But among southern horse types, such as the Lusitanos, you sometimes find horses that, similar to zebras, form a kind of semicircle when a predator approaches, like broodmares, for example, shielding their foals behind them. And if they feel safe enough, because they are enough in number, they would even attack the predator. So there are all these kinds of behaviors, and they also still exist today and can, under certain circumstances, still be triggered. And now coming back to a difficult horse, the horse has experienced that being ridden is associated with mortal panic. And this panic is triggered again and again simply by the idea of being ridden. From the horse's perspective, this is then linked to a complete state of tension. And in his case, that tension leads him first to freeze. And from that frozen state, he then tries to flee. And this leads him into uncoordinated movements. And that's why he falls over. This is already a special case, and even after 4.5 years, it's still a challenge because all kinds of small details can re-trigger this underlying fear. These are the so-called triggers, which are also known in humans. You can't simply erase them, and with horses, you also can't use psychotherapy with conversation or becoming aware or anything like that. And yes, there are maybe people who specialize in this and who have their own methods, but it's still different from working with humans. There are also approaches like that, but you have to be very inventive. And that's why I also often ended up working with difficult horses because they require immense creativity and many other approaches. I've learned the most from difficult horses, and that's also why I find them the most interesting, but I also like challenges. I think I'm drawn to challenges, and if there aren't any difficulties at all, it can become a bit boring for me. Although having none at all almost never exists in horse training anyway, horse training rarely gets boring. But I've also been interested in very complicated cases, and sometimes I get frustrated and think, what on earth have you taken on here? You could train 3 or 4 horses in the time you spend on just this one.
Yeah, it's true.
It's also a bit uneconomical.
But for example, even with such difficult horses, you can also do the higher movements no problem, like piaffe and passage, and you've also now brought them to a very high level.
Yes, but there is still, at least in his case, a remaining issue where the body doesn't yet function so well. Because if I don't manage to relax the horse, relaxation is the prerequisite for developing new movement patterns or also postural patterns. And if you're not able to establish that relaxation at all, then those new patterns can't develop. This is then another reason why balance and relaxation are absolutely fundamental pillars, on which the entire training can then be gradually built. And only once you have balance and relaxation, to put it simply, can you actually begin to properly activate the horse. If you activate too much too early, you may lose either balance or relaxation, and that can also mean that these elements are sometimes addressed in an alternating way, depending on the situation.
Yeah, totally.
But of course, there are methodological differences, and at the moment, I tend to focus more on balance, and in fact, energy and activation increasingly arise on their own through the collection that develops in the body, through carefully structured sequences of exercises, or also through the specific way in which I do an exercise.
There was another topic I found very interesting, and that was that you mentioned earlier before we started recording that the riding approach you're using now is actually relevant for much more than just dressage and for much more than just one type of horse. It's actually very relevant regardless of what breed or even what discipline, because it's about the nature of the horse. Do you have any more to share about this?
Yes, there's a nice saying that goes, all riding styles have one thing in common, namely the horse. And even though breeding naturally creates differences in conformation, in movements, in character, in suitability, strength, and all kinds of other factors, there's still something that makes it a horse. And if you want to ride a horse, you have to meet certain requirements so that it's not just chance and luck, that the horse stays healthy and is able to find a reasonably functional way of going on its own. Of course, that does exist. There are also working horse breeds, for example, some mountain horses, which are so robust that they can be used for driving and riding without wearing out so quickly. I don't want to say that there are no breeds in the world that need less of this type of training than others. There are certainly big differences, but for every horse, no matter what you want to do with it, it's a huge advantage if you bring it into complete balance. So, in every respect, not only in terms of keeping it healthy, but also in terms of its use for its intended purpose, whatever that may be, it becomes much more comfortable for you and of course for the horse as well, and you'll be able to achieve it more successfully. And I also have an example of this. I used to train a woman who was an endurance rider, and she managed to reach the world's top level with a relatively small horse, an Arabian cross, to the point where she was invited to the World Championships in Dubai and also to the European Championships in Spain at the time. And she trained very regularly with me, not only with me, but for a long time and very intensively in dressage lessons, to bring this horse into a good balance, to straighten it, relax it, and establish all these basic prerequisites for collection. And this horse never dropped out over countless kilometers in competition. It never went lame or anything. And when she was at events and the physiotherapists and veterinarians checked the horse, she was always told, wow, this horse is in exceptionally good condition. And in this case, dressage was clearly only ever a side effect. It was to ensure that the main purpose was achieved, which was covering long distances, and in this case, really up to 100 miles, since an endurance horse is trained over years. And if you want to reach the top level, you ride up to 160 kilometers in a single day. And if the horse has a solid dressage foundation, this gives you a really big advantage, because from a training perspective, it's also extremely beneficial. In the basic training of a horse, you actually first try to establish the correct movement patterns and proper coordination, and only then should something like strength and endurance training follow. This is actually quite logical, because if I train a horse over many kilometers in an incorrect position, I'll already cause wear and tear, or I'll further habituate the horse to an incorrect way of moving. And then stiffening of the fascia and connective tissue can occur, with all its subsequent effects. This was an important example where, in a competitive sport of a completely different discipline, dressage was simply there to ensure that the actual purpose worked well.
Looking at equestrian sport today, is there anything you'd like to see more often? What would you want to see more of?
I would, of course, wish that we would see horses that are doing well with a complete basic training that properly develops their body, and that only then would they move on to the higher level, but always under naturally developed conditions. And that may mean that a little bit of the spectacle is decreased. So, for example, the height of the forelegs might be somewhat less, but the beauty and harmony, and also the relationship between rider and horse, the communication, the connection, the lightness. I keep seeing that people respond very strongly to that and find it really beautiful, and are then also willing to let go of a bit of the spectacle.
Yeah, I've also noticed that as well, even in competition. For example, there are some riders who ride with a bit more lightness, and there's an amazing amount of comments about how beautiful it is and really how much they appreciate seeing that.
Yes, and you can also see it in the expression of the animals, and not just in their facial expression. The whole body naturally expresses something, and horses also have many ways of showing defensive behavior. Their facial expression, body language, tail swishing, these are the typical ones. What's a bit unfortunate for the horse is that it doesn't express pain by vocalizing it. For example, a dog couldn't be ridden in the same way some horses are, because it would often yelp, and nobody would want to hear that. The problem is that the horse expresses discomfort very quietly, but quietly only in an acoustic sense. You can certainly see whether it feels well or not, and what's particularly devastating is that certain muscle groups are now being numbed so that tails swish less, or ear positions are manipulated in order to suppress these defensive behaviors to make them less visible. If I imagine that, I find it truly perverse. It's a violation of a living being. I would very much wish that human creativity, when it comes to becoming better in sport, wouldn't go in that direction, but rather towards training methods. I've repeatedly found that when I performed something at events and it turned out well with a strong sense of harmony, people were very enthusiastic. Even people who are actually interested in the sport, but who rarely see this level of harmony and lightness within it, which is also a big issue. What's important is to go out and present something different and to provide people with an alternative picture, because one does become accustomed to some things and starts to think of them as normal. That's something very common. That's just how humans are. Yeah, you can't exclude that. This means that people also become accustomed to problems in the sport because they think that that's just how it is. And in some rides, I see, and that I don't like at all, when I hear commentators describing them as a beautiful dance, I think you haven't even seen a truly beautiful dance yet, where the animal is fully able to express itself. I mean, I'm always cautious when it comes to interpreting what a horse wants. I believe my horses also enjoy going out to the field, eating, and doing their things. They also come and I think enjoy the work as well, and there are many indications of that. But there are certainly differences in motivation, and it's so important to show this to people, I believe, because you don't need to know anything about riding or horses in order to recognize harmony and beauty. On the contrary, sometimes it's trained eyes that are accustomed to certain unusual movement patterns in the sport that are more blind or less open and free in their perception, including emotional perception, than someone who has had nothing to do with it. If you're a little bit perceptive, then you can, I think, very quickly distinguish one from the other.
Yeah, true. And I also think that nowadays you can find so much online, and there are also still some very small corners in the writing world that are sort of isolated. They only look at a few things that come from a particular circle. And I think this is actually an important time now because everyone can and they have the opportunity to look at different approaches and philosophies and understandings and benefit from them. It's an amazing opportunity we have now. And I think we also discussed yesterday how important it is that every rider finds their own path. So they can look around and choose for themselves by seeing what's available online or nearby. Because there are many who are interested in something different, but maybe there's no trainer nearby. But no, there are also things online, or there are other possibilities. And this is why I appreciate, for example, how much you post online. There's so much good content about this knowledge and understanding, so more people can benefit from it. But it's still, I think, very important that we all have this freedom to find our own path as riders.
I'm totally with you on that, but we also talked about this yesterday, that when you decide on something, it's so important to follow that path for a while, to really get to know it, in order to even come close to being able to judge it. There are people who say, I just take the best from everywhere, but they would have to be extraordinarily talented to manage to combine all the different things from the beginning and still make something work out of it. The average rider is much better off choosing one trainer first, above all, based on gut feeling. It has to feel right. Staying with that trainer for a while and then gradually expanding their knowledge step by step, but only after gaining some solid foundational experience. This trainer hopping doesn't help, and it's also one of the disadvantages of having many options available through social media and the internet. You're exposed to more and more approaches. There are lots of good explanations, and then one says, try this, try that, and in the end, nothing really comes out of it, and a trainer never even gets a proper chance. That's one aspect of it. The other thing is that through all these images you see, you get the impression that, oh, poof, just like that, suddenly I can do this movement and that movement. And in my view, and also I haven't heard any rider I truly take seriously, including trainers and riding masters, say anything different. It's painstaking work that takes many long years, and you also have to be able to tolerate a lot of frustration. That's simply part of it. And if, for example, you teach a horse too many movements too early, almost like circus tricks, now do this, now do that, then as appealing as this may look, it unfortunately doesn't serve the goal of what a riding horse needs in order to be thoroughly trained and correctly developed. It's so important to realize that, for example, at least in the past, I don't know how it is now, but a stallion at the Spanish riding school in Vienna received at least 6 years of training. He came straight from the field and then spent 6 years in professional hands with riders who had a lot of professional exchange and an immense amount of knowledge. And still, that's simply how it is. It takes 6 years. Now, as amateur riders, we don't have this environment. We get a horse, often because we don't want to or can't spend a lot of money. That may already come with some issues or hasn't been ideally bred or raised, or we even create some of the problems ourselves. We're not professionals, and yet we're supposed to have trained our horse through a few weekend clinics and a few, to put it a bit provocatively, party tricks. It's simply not that easy. What really matters is learning the fundamentals properly from the ground up, first as a rider, ideally on well-trained horses, so you can receive clear feedback from the horse, and only then learning with your own horse. But unfortunately, those conditions are very, very rare nowadays. It's a bit paradoxical that we have everything, and yet some things aren't that easy.
Yes, and I would also agree. Exactly, like we discussed yesterday, it's really important to stay with one trainer or one method for a while. In my opinion, at least 1, 2, or 3 years, so that you can really have some sense of how every step builds on top of the last one that came before it. No? And for the listeners who have heard you today and who feel a bit inspired, how could they find out more about you and your work?
So you can find me online under Sonja Weber Reitkunst at www.sonja-weber-reitkunst.de. That's my homepage, and from there you can also access my video platform. I've made many videos, and the main piece is a 6-part series titled Riding in Collection for Healthy Horses and Lightness. And it's essentially the film adaptation of my 2 books, and they're quite comprehensive. They're 2 substantial volumes filled with a lot of knowledge, I believe, and as I've often been told, also clear and easy to follow. In the film, some aspects are even easier to understand through the images, so the combination is ideal. Otherwise, in my practice, I now focus almost exclusively on training trainers. I have a trainer program in which the training takes place over several years, but I also have trainers who come independently for lessons. After completing this training, they can of course take an exam and then call themselves trainers of my methods. Although in the future there will also be other possibilities to do so without being fully part of this closed program. And yeah, I have a lot of material for this, especially in video form. And I think that if people aren't yet at that level, I can also recommend my trainers. The films are actually the best way to get an impression of whether this approach suits them personally or not, because there has to be a spark. Without that gut feeling, one shouldn't do anything.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you've put so much online and also in English. It's in both German and English, which is good to know. I really appreciate everything that you do. It's really valuable for me and others to see. And thank you so much for being here. I just find it so important that people begin to see the connection between the horse's physical development and its health through training, and also how you actually do that. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I was also very happy about the invitation. I've watched the first episodes and I think the whole idea is great, and I'm glad it's found so much resonance. I also hope that after what's already been discussed here, I might have been able to contribute a few details in a certain direction, and I'm always glad when I can do something meaningful. So thank you very much, dear Maria.
Thank you.